Prabhupada ki. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to the assembled devotees. All glories to Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. Would the assembled Vaishnavas and guests like to come a little closer, if you would like? It's a large temple hall and not very many individuals inside. Or maybe because of COVID, everybody wants to stay a little separately, maybe. So the topic for today's Sunday Feast class. How many have been to a Sunday Feast class before? First time? First time? In Sydney? Okay, Hare Krishna. So, how many of the individuals here have heard about Srila Prabhupada? You've heard about Srila Prabhupada? So, the personality sitting at the back of the temple room on the Vyasa-san, that is Srila Prabhupada. And he's known as the founder Acharya of ISKCON. Really, to understand ISKCON and what makes it distinct in its vision, in its aim, from so many other temples that we can visit and we can be nourished by, really comes down to understanding what Srila Prabhupada, who he was, what he wanted, what his mood was. So today's class is about Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada is that unifying factor through all of ISKCON. Every facet of what you see here, for example, how the aratis are conducted, what is offered, what is sung, how individuals within this community greet each other, their respective aspirations, the books they read, all of this is understood by understanding Srila Prabhupada himself. So, Srila Prabhupada was born as Abhay Charande. He was born in 1896. So not just last century, the century before that. And of course he was born at a time of British rule. He was educated in, I think, the Scottish College within Calcutta. And he graduated when he was 18. But in his youth, he was raised by, of course, his parents, Gaur Mohan De, and his mother. Now, his parents came from a Vaishnava family. And Srila Prabhupada explains that at that time, most of Calcutta lived in harmony. So you would have Vaishnavas and individuals from other cultures, such as Muslims and Christians, and they would all stay within that area, and they would intermingle very pleasantly. There were hardly any difficulties amongst each other. And he describes that in his youth, he was part of the Malik family. Right now, if you go to the place where Srila Prabhupada appeared, it's actually a very busy business district. But he was born in an area, the Maliks were a business class family. And they operated many different kinds of businesses, including cloth and other such industries within Calcutta. But Srila Prabhupada was born into the Malik household. And the Maliks were a very pious family, and they sponsored the worship of Radha Krishna deities, Radha Govinda deities right opposite their mansion. And Srila Prabhupada explains that even as a young kid, Srila Prabhupada and his sister, Bhavatarini, would go and take darshan of Radha Govinda. And he would state that for hours and hours we would just see the form of the Lord. But what this glimpse gives us is almost the culture of society, Indian society at that time, that is long forgotten, especially here in the environment of Sydney. We grow up with, so many other things. Most of us live in apartments, or if we're living in a small house, we are focused on our work, we are focused on our children, on their education, on their next steps in life. But in Vedic society, in Indian society at that time, every wealthy family usually had a temple within their home, or they would have a temple nearby, where they would go and they would observe the festivities associated with Radha Krishna or other deities in their particular neighborhood. So Srila Prabhupada grew up in that kind of culture and family. And although he was born in a family that was relatively well-to-do, and he was educated in a very good way, his father in particular prioritized his son's education in devotional activities. So his mother would bring an English tutor, because in those times it was British-ruled India. And so the intention was that if everybody studied in a college sponsored by the English administrators, the kids would have better opportunities in society. So his mother wanted to bring an English tutor home, but his father ensured that there was still a devotional component to his education in the form of bringing mridanga teachers or harmonium teachers. And within the home itself, his father worshipped Radha Krishna deities and established a culture of devotion amongst the day-to-day schedule. He also made sure that he would continue to invite visiting guests home, and like sadhus. Or in India that time, of course, you would have many sadhus. It's hard to know who was genuine, who was not genuine. But his father would make it a practice to invite these individuals home and somehow the other feed them. Sometimes these sadhus would later be seen like smoking hookah or other such things on the street. But nonetheless, this culture of inviting visiting sadhus home and giving them prasadam and seeking their blessings was established within the household. And every time these sadhus would come, Srila Prabhupada's father in particular, Gaur Mohan Dey, would beg them, please may my son become a servant of Radharani. Later on, as Srila Prabhupada grew up, because he would observe his father worship Radha Krishna deities. His father was a cloth merchant, and so he would usually wake up a little late, 7 to 8 in the morning, and he would do some basic grocery shopping nearby, and he would do his deity worship. His deity worship would take him 3 hours. That was the principal service he would render at home. So 10 to 1, he would be involved in performing various like aratis or singing kirtan for the Lord. And at 1 o'clock, he would take a little prasadam and he would leave for his work, which was a cloth shop, a little further down, away from his house. He would work there from around 1 p.m. to around 10 p.m. He would come home and he would again perform arati for their lordships. Before leaving the cloth shop, he would take a bowl of rice, of prasadam rice, and he would leave it in the middle of the cloth shop. Why do you think he would do that? Who would eat that rice?
To give the customers?
No, before he left the shop, before closing the shop, he would take a bowl of rice, cooked prasadam rice, and he would place it in the middle of his shop and then leave. But why? What is it that runs around cloth shops or any shop at the night time when the owners are not there? In India? Rats. So to make sure the rats wouldn't eat the cloth, but at the same time would be benefited with prasadam, he would leave some prasadam grains, like in the form of a bowl of rice. He would leave it in the middle of the cloth shop and then go home. So he would go home, and Srila Prabhupada, and of course the other children, Srila Prabhupada had 3 other brothers and sisters. So they would all be sleeping, typically. 10 o'clock is late for children. And so, but when Gaur Mohan Dey would come home, he would start ringing the bell to perform the last arati of the day. And then his son, Srila Prabhupada, his birth name was Abhay Charan. So Abhay Charan would get up and he would observe his father performing the worship. And then his father would sit down and take a meal of hot puris and sabji. And Abhay Charan would demand a similar plate for himself. And his father would want him to sit nearby and he would want him to eat with him. But Srila Prabhupada's upbringing was an upbringing surrounded in a devotional culture. That was the principal point I wanted to draw out. Despite the normal day-to-day activities of earning money for the family, of educating the children, there was an environment where devotional activities were heavily prominent in that particular household. As Srila Prabhupada grew up and was observing his father worship Radha Krishna deities, he himself developed the desire to worship Radha Krishna deities himself, as any kid would do. You see your parents do something, you want to replicate it to yourself. So he observed this. Sorry? Mic is low. Is that... Is that better? Okay, sorry. So just as any parents, when they're doing something, the children want to replicate. Is that okay? The children want to replicate what their parents are doing. Srila Prabhupada similarly wanted to replicate the worship of Radha and Krishna that his parents had. So what this shows us is the activities that the parents have. If we want children to have good culture, if we want our children to value proper things in their life, which come from that culture of piety, of that commitment and the duty that we establish in our own household. it is really important that we also establish that temple culture within our own home. And that was what Srila Prabhupada had. But when Srila Prabhupada developed this desire to worship Radha Krishna deities, his father brought him a set of Radha Krishna deities to worship at home. And in this way, life kind of moved on. Another important incident was when Srila Prabhupada wanted to conduct Ratha Yatra. And later on, Srila Prabhupada would say that everything that I've done in ISKCON, like in terms of set up deity worship, in terms of set up Ratha Yatra, I took those principles from what my parents taught me. Because his parents were following existing traditions of deity worship either in Jagannath Puri or in Jaipur. So these are long established traditions of how devotional service to the Lord is performed. But Srila Prabhupada learned it from the very beginning of his life. And when Srila Prabhupada in 1967, he came to San Francisco, it is a very interesting incident. So Srila Prabhupada at this time was a sannyasi. And he had just started the movement in the sense that he came, he saw individuals who were looking for certain answers to their life. And he just took a pair of kartals, he went to Tompkins Square Park in New York. He sat down and just began to chant Hare Krishna. Now the individuals who were there, they didn't know who the Swami was. They knew he was a Swami. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know what he was chanting. But they thought it was like a musical jam-in. And in those days, if there were a group of individuals coming to, musically connect, there was no need for an invitation. Anybody would just come in, sit down, bring whatever instrument they had, and just kind of mold in to the scene that was happening. So Srila Prabhupada, he just took his kartals, and he started singing Hare Krishna in a park under a tree. And that tree is still there, that park is still there. But attracted by Srila Prabhupada's singing of Hare Krishna, they didn't know what he was singing, they didn't know who he was. Many others came and they sat around him and they began to sing with Srila Prabhupada. When they had sung together for some time, Srila Prabhupada took them back to where he was staying in a small storefront apartment. And he would begin to explain to them small principles in Krishna consciousness. They didn't even understand what his accent was or what he was saying or who this Krishna was. They'd never heard of Krishna before. But observing that here is somebody who is very elderly, who seemed to be very intent on giving something. There was nothing that he was taking for himself. But there was an urgency about his speech. There was an urgency, please take this. This is really something that is needed. And he was presenting it with that urgency. Individuals felt there's something important here. I don't know what it is. I don't know what he's saying. I can hardly understand his accent. But there's something I need to inquire about further. And they stayed. They started asking questions. And they started to inquire a bit further. So in this way, the congregation initially developed. So this is 1965. 1967, the first Ratha Yatra happened in the Western countries. This was in San Francisco. And Srila Prabhupada later recollected that those childhood pastimes that I had when I was a kid, like for example, when my father allowed me to take a Jagannath Ratha Yatra around our neighborhood, and all the neighboring ladies would prepare something and come and offer it to Jagannath on the cart, and then that prasadam would be distributed amongst everyone in the neighborhood. He said those experiences were what I recreated later on when ISKCON started. So the one important lesson we learned from Srila Prabhupada's life is the necessity of having a strong devotional culture at home. We don't know where our children will end up in life. We don't know where they will go. Because as they grow up, they will start to depend less upon us. They will start to mingle with their friends, and as they are educated, they start to make their own choices in life. Their choices in life may be very different from the choices that we have made as adults. But the best thing we can give them is a strong moral compass and that anchor in Radha Gopinath. If we can give them that anchor, no matter where they go or what choices they make, they will always have that compass that tells them whether they are on track or away from that mark. And they will be able to bring themselves back, even if they drift away. That's the first important lesson that we learn. Srila Prabhupada was 18, and he had graduated from his college. And he was looking for what he needs to do. And of course, that time was very politically surcharged. There were a lot of riots that were happening against the British establishment. And you had the Gandhian movement, you had Subhash Chandra Bose, all of whom were fighting for independence at that time. So a lot of young individuals, inspired by that movement, decided not to accept the degrees conferred upon them by their universities or colleges. So Srila Prabhupada had received a degree, but he chose not to accept it. And his father was naturally worried. How will my son be established in life? How will he maintain himself? He contacted a friend who was running a pharmaceutical business, and he requested him to take Abhay Charan and train him as a pharmaceutical representative to help him manage the business. And so one day, Abhay Charan could stand up on his own feet. What we understand from this is the practical viewpoint that a parent needs to have. A parent needs to equip their child with the right moral compass, but also take the right steps to ensure that they have a consistent base from which they can stand up and support themselves so that they can consistently grow and endeavor towards devotional service in their life. So his father was very practical and set up Srila Prabhupada's basis in that way. Srila Prabhupada entered the pharmacy. He subsequently got married. One of his friends, Naresh, and this was when Srila Prabhupada was around 21, he approached Srila Prabhupada. Of course, his name was Srila Charan at that time. And he said, I have met a great sadhu. Would you like to see him? Now, Srila Prabhupada had grown up with sadhus coming to his home. We have heard how his father would invite sadhu after sadhu after sadhu repeatedly from the street home, would feed them and would beg them, please may my son become a servant of Radharani. And so Srila Prabhupada had seen many fake sadhus. And that appreciation for what a true sadhu was not there because he had never seen a true sadhu before. So he was told, here's a wonderful sadhu, I want you to meet him. And Srila Prabhupada's initial reaction was, no, I don't want to meet him. Because I've seen many sadhus in my life, they're all one. In terms of they take something, they give some blessings, and then afterwards their character is seen to be something different from saintly life. But his friend insisted, he said, this sadhu is different. This sadhu is actually special. You should come and see him. And Prabhupada later said that practically my friend forced me to come and meet this sadhu. That sadhu was Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. To give you an understanding of who he was, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was the son of another great personality, Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur is practically single-handedly responsible for reviving this tradition, which we call the Chaitanya Gaudiya tradition, or Madhva Gaudiya tradition. What had happened was that Lord Chaitanya, who is Krishna himself, had come and established a mood of devotional service towards Radha and Krishna in Vrindavan. This was 500 and something years ago. He had done this in Mayapur, which is a village 300 kilometers away from Calcutta. Having established that culture over the period of, say, 400 or so years, that culture had largely become diluted. A lot of people were, in the name of following Lord Chaitanya's tradition, they would take on Babaji Vesha, which is a form of renunciation, but use that for their own activities, either for money or for illicitly engaging with the opposite gender. And so the name of the Gaudiya tradition had become very, very low. Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur had single-handedly revived that tradition and established it as a proper tradition for individuals to follow. He had established it by writing over 100 books. He had established it by setting up Namahata centers where the chanting of Krishna's names were established. He himself was a very reputed district magistrate, which was the highest position one could go to under a British government. But because of his own reputation, because of his own endeavors and his own devotional advancement, he re-established the credibility of the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition. He had trained his son Srila Bhaktisiddhanta in editing books and in devotional principles. And his son had established 64 Gaudiya Math centers within India, many of which are still existent now. So this was the personality that genuine representative of an age-old tradition to whom Srila Prabhupada was taken. To find such a personality is in fact extremely rare. Those of us who have tried to find... How many here have tried to find spiritual life themselves? Like gone to hear different classes or different lectures in places? Yeah? My father, when he was younger, he was looking to find a spiritual master. So he would go to one mission, he would go to another place, he would go to another guru, and he would keep going and listening from one person to the next. But throughout these lectures, there was some standard language that was being spoken. Sometimes some individuals would speak about the need to develop personal qualities. Some people would speak about the Lord not being a person and the need to merge into His form. Some people would speak about spiritual life as if it was intended to galvanize the national movement or invigorate national pride. Or some people were focused on yoga, some people were focused on other things. But none of these traditions, in my experience, my father's experience, or the experience of others that I've spoken to, have provided clear-cut knowledge and direction to the intelligence to learn who I am, why am I here, and where am I going in life. These clear-cut instructions and directions that training, very few institutions directly provide. And so to find such a personality in the midst of an age where people are starting to focus more on materialism, there's a general culture of spiritual piety, but very little knowledge. And there are many charlatans who, in the name of spiritual life, are doing their own thing. It's genuinely difficult. But Srila Prabhupada was introduced to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. And the moment he met him, before he had even properly entered the room and offered respects to this sadhu, that sadhu asked him, "You are an educated man. Why don't you preach the teachings of Lord Chaitanya in the English language?" And this struck him forcefully. He offered obeisances. He got up and said, "But India is under the British rule right now. Who will take this Gaudiya tradition seriously? Who will take the Vedic teachings in their proper perspective? People will think that these teachings are just the teachings of a subjugated culture, a subjugated population." So our first step, and this was echoing the sentiment of that day, this was echoing the Gandhian or other movements that were present and prevalent at that time. And so the question was, why don't we wait until we become free as a nation? Why don't we throw off this British establishment, reinvigorate our national pride, and then from that position, give this culture to others? Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's answer was very grave and it was very direct. He said, "There isn't enough time." He said, "You don't understand the urgency of this message. The urgency of this message deals with every spirit soul, regardless of whether they're Indian, whether they're British, or whether they come from any other culture. The living entity is eternally a servant of the Lord. And all of these events that are happening that we consider to be important in some way are peripheral to actually what we need and who we are." He said that you think that nationalism is the big thing of that time. Well, you fast forward time or you prepone time. At every stage in history, there's always been something that's been considered to be important. Sometimes it's nationalism, sometimes it's making money, sometimes it's about enjoying life, sometimes it's about taking care of family, and there are always different priorities that appear during life. If you have to wait until these priorities are satisfied and dealt with, you will never have enough time for Krishna consciousness. Because what is Krishna consciousness? Krishna consciousness is the actual nature of the spirit soul. In his Bhagavad Gita purport, in the introduction to the Bhagavad Gita, Srila Prabhupada writes, "People think religion is some kind of faith. People think religion refers to a set of beliefs that can be changed. But religion actually refers to Dharma. Dharma, in its literal Sanskrit sense, refers to that property of the spirit soul that can never be taken away. Just as water's nature is to be liquid, salt's nature is to be salty. And just as you cannot take away the saltiness of salt or the liquidness of water, similarly, the actual dharma of the jiva, of the living entity, you can never take away from the living entity. And then he explains in his introduction, what is that essential dharma of the living entity? He says, if we look at ourselves, whether we are just dealing with ourselves or whether we're dealing with a family or a community, our mood is to always want to connect to something bigger than ourselves. Yes, initially it may be that we are trying to fulfill our own needs. Our ears want something, our eyes want to see something, we want to taste something. We are serving the needs of our senses. But then there are others who are serving the needs of their family. There are yet others who are serving in an office or in a broader community. Or some individuals magnanimously are serving the whole of humanity. But the essential commonality between all of these individuals, whether they're human beings or whether they're animals, is that their mood is of service. To connect to another person, to connect to another community, and offer something to them for that person's pleasure is a natural part of who we are. And whether that is done in an isolated way within our own family or within a broader spectrum because our heart is that much bigger, it doesn't change that essential property of that need of wanting to be part of something, wanting to serve, either in a restricted or in a broader way. So this mood of service is the essential nature of the living entity. And he says, the original nature of the living entity is to be a servant of the Lord. And it is in service to the Lord that all of our needs, all of our desires, everything that we want to experience is actually completely satisfied. When somebody doesn't have this, that is when that hole in the heart is filled in by expressing one's loving propensity, that desire to serve in a more restricted and limited capacity. And this succinctly was expressed by Srila Bhaktisiddhanta. He said, these concepts of nationalism, etc., they are here now, they're gone tomorrow. But it doesn't change the actual thing that needs to change. And time and history have proved this statement to be correct. Nationalism has come and it is gone. And India has been free of British rule for so many years now, over 70 years. But it hasn't changed people's needs. People were unhappy at some point in the future. They're as unhappy or happy now. The need of the living entity stays the same. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta said, this is the most urgent priority and it cannot wait. When Srila Prabhupada heard this conviction from Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, he understood. Here is a person who is an expert. He really understands with conviction what Lord Chaitanya's teachings are. He really understands things in proper perspective. And his instantaneous reaction was, I want to take shelter of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta. So Srila Prabhupada's life, in the beginning of his life, was surrounded with the devotional culture that was provided by his family. But that was refined and directed when he met his spiritual master, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur. He was not able to, the instruction that was given to him, you are an educated man, why don't you preach the teachings of Lord Chaitanya in the English language? That instruction hit him very, very deeply. Because why the teachings of Lord Chaitanya? Why not teachings just to be a good person or to practice ahimsa or so many other things that are considered to be valuable lessons in society? It's because Lord Chaitanya's teachings are the most direct way in which we can attain happiness and we can spread happiness to others. In this day and age, there are many things that restrict our ability to do exactly this. One, we hardly have any time. Society is so competitive and so materially oriented that if we get with a young family even an hour or 2 hours in the day to ourselves to do anything, that's really wonderful. So long gone are those days where some individuals can read an extensive list of books, debate Shastra, or perform elaborate rituals. Long gone are the days where simple piety is sufficient. Most people now come from an educated background, where they are trained in modern science, mathematics, physics, etc., all of which emphasize that we are nothing but the body, and our life finishes with the end of this body. There's nothing different taught in today's education. We are taught the process of getting what you want in this life is competition. That's why we go through our exams. That's why we fight for places. That's why we take interviews for jobs. It's a competitive society with very little time. And even when we do get time, if we are seeking for spiritual life, where do we go to for guidance? What do we read? Do we Google questions? Whose answers do we get to read? But Lord Chaitanya's process is very, very direct. His teachings were that the living entity is always a servant of Krishna, and his nature can be revived by the chanting of the Lord's names. Just as when a sleeping man is awoken by the sound of an alarm bell, similarly, all of us who are sleeping because we are unaware of our actual nature, when we come across the chanting of Hare Krishna, it's like a person is awoken from deep sleep and is made aware of the actual reality that they're in. They're able to see everything in their world in proper perspective. Lord Chaitanya taught the names of God are non-different to God himself. It is not necessary to sit in abstraction and meditate. It is not even necessary or possible for people to perform elaborate deity worship. It is not possible for people to necessarily go to isolated places and perform spiritual practices either. What is most possible is wherever you are, wherever you may be sitting or whatever you may be doing, you can just take up the Lord's names. But the constant chanting of the Lord's names in a mood of dependence, in a mood of surrender, without duplicity, in a mood of wanting to serve the Lord, the devotees, and people in general. When one chants the Lord's names in this mood of humility, then all perfection can be achieved, not just for oneself, but for everyone in society. And this was Lord Chaitanya's principal teaching. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta was very clear. He said, you take this message and you spread it in the English-speaking language. Because people need logic, reasoning, argument in order to accept this point. Therefore, there are so many books to argue this central point. But he said, you're an educated man. You take up this teaching and you spread it all over the world. This instruction hit Srila Prabhupada very, very deeply. He was but 21, 22 at this time. He wondered how he could take up this instruction. This was not the first person to whom Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had made this request. He had given this request to many, many individuals. To all of them he had said, you are educated, you speak English. Now, please, give this message to others. This was the urgency Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had. Srila Prabhupada, when he came to the West, when he was practically 60 or 70 years old. This was in 1965. So at this age, he was 69. But at this age, there was a burning fire. Because from when he was about 22 years old, so I'm talking 1918, 1920, when he met Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, up to 1965, for 45 years, he had been waiting for a time of how he could fulfill this desire, how he could fulfill this instruction. And he had tried in his own way. He had tried when he was married and in a family. He had tried by starting movements or trying to preach himself in India. But when the opportunity came in 1965, he had come to the West. He came to the West with about 40 rupees, which in those days, according to the currency, was about $7. It's not a lot of money. But he also came with Srimad Bhagavatam books, because Srila Prabhupada had received another important instruction in his life. At a later time, so before 1965, but after the first meeting in 1918, 1920, he had met Srila Bhaktisiddhanta. And Srila Bhaktisiddhanta was walking in Vrindavan near Radha Kund. And he happened to turn towards Srila Prabhupada and said, it was a mistake to make, there was one particular marble temple that they'd constructed in Bagh Bazaar in Calcutta. He said it was a mistake to have constructed that temple, because since that temple was constructed, the individuals who are residing in the temple are more worried about which rooms they should take rather than distributing this message of Krishna consciousness. He said it would have been better to have used that money to print books. Even now, it would be better if we sold that marble and used that money in order to print books. In fact, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, in one of his temples, maybe it was the Bagh Bazaar temple, in the temple room itself, he had established a printing press. How many of you have seen a printing press before? How many of you know how much noise it makes when you print paper or books? A printing press was established in the temple room. Why? Even though it makes a lot of noise, that noise was considered to be sankirtan. It was considered to be preaching, or the distribution of the Lord's names in the form of the written word. And hundreds and thousands of books were printed on that printing press located in the temple room to make prominent the fact that any literature which glorifies the Lord, which teaches people to go towards the Lord and chant His names, that is the best way to reach people. That is the best way to get them to come closer to the Lord. In this day and age, not everybody comes to the temple. But if somebody can pick up a book and take it home, it can, and it will transform their life. And so Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, on this fateful day in Radhakund, he had told Srila Prabhupada this. He said, so whenever you get money, he said, and at this time Srila Prabhupada was but a married man with his own family, with personal struggles. So he received this instruction at that time. He was told, if you get money, if you ever get money, just use it to print books. So later on, so Srila Prabhupada had started a Back to Godhead magazine. And you will still see this magazine. If you go past here, you will see this. How many of you have seen this? Back to Godhead magazine? You will see this Back to Godhead magazine on the bookstall. So Srila Prabhupada had initially started this magazine and was using it to write articles explaining the science of devotional service. At some point, 1955 approximately, somebody told him, he was told, if you're printing magazines, people will take it and sometimes dispose of it. What stays in people's homes are books. So you should write books. So at that time, Srila Prabhupada switched from writing from magazines into books. And one prominent thing you will see in ISKCON that you will never see in other temples so prominently are books upon books upon books. Transcendental literature that may not be necessarily as eloquent as the books you may find in libraries, but transcendental literature that glorifies the name, form, qualities, and pastimes of the Lord. Printed in over, how many languages? 150, 160 odd languages, distributed all around the world. In fact, the December month is known as the Christmas of Book Distribution Marathon month. And this was started by Srila Prabhupada when he was here with us to ensure that at that time, of course, the young boys and girls who had come to him for training, they were highly competitive. And so Srila Prabhupada wanted to engage their passion and their energy. And this marathon month was created almost spontaneously and encouraged by Srila Prabhupada so that the distribution of these literatures could go out to the public and people could learn what the actual solution to the problems of life were and could help themselves, could come amongst the association of the devotees and be benefited in that way. So the emphasis that Srila Prabhupada placed was on books, was on training, was on education. What you see here, this building, it doesn't look from the outside like a temple, because that was never Srila Prabhupada's emphasis. If it does, it's wonderful. People recognize it, they come. This building from the outside looks nondescript. It just looks like a normal building. But when you come inside, the environment is completely different. And you will notice that in ISKCON programs, morning, evening, and at other times separately, either in the congregation or in specific training programs, it is the books, Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, Chaitanya Charitamrita, and many other small books that are taught and emphasized over and over again. Whenever we speak, whenever we hear, there is a reference made to these books. And Srila Prabhupada wanted the devotees to be expertly trained in these literatures, so that not only do we follow this tradition out of piety or some sense of obligation, but we actually become convinced that these teachings are essential for our life. And we use these teachings in order to change our life and to change others. And this was Srila Prabhupada's emphasis. There's a picture that some of you would have seen or will see of Srila Prabhupada. He's opening the 5th canto of Bhagavatam when it was printed. He had translated, it had been published. He was opening it, and there was so much happiness when Srila Prabhupada was opening the book. He said, when I see and open a printed book like this, I feel like I've conquered an empire. And that was Srila Prabhupada's mood. Just as there's so much literature out there that emphasizes so many other things, one literature that tells us we are servants of Krishna, our happiness lies in chanting Krishna's names, in developing a mood of service to the Lord. That one literature is a victory against all of that literature, which emphasizes the opposite, which emphasizes destructive qualities that cause us to forget that we are a servant of the Lord. And that you will understand to be a central defining feature of ISKCON. Books, training, education. So this December month is coming. This month was very dear to Srila Prabhupada. If the Vaishnavas here would like to either take a book for themselves as they're on the way out, or even take a book or a couple of books and distribute it to individuals that they know, this is the best service one can do for humanity. This is the best service one can do for people in general, and one should know this. The second emphasis that Srila Prabhupada laid, because one time Prabhupada said, the purpose of reading all of these books is so that you will learn to chant Hare Krishna. And whenever Srila Prabhupada would see individuals chant Hare Krishna, he was just so happy. When I think of this, there's an image in my mind. 1972, Srila Prabhupada had taken the devotees to Vrindavan. And this was among the first time that the devotees were entering Vrindavan. When Srila Prabhupada went there, he had gone to the Yamuna river. And the devotees were bathing in with Srila Prabhupada, and they were chanting Gayatri in the Yamuna river with Srila Prabhupada. After chanting Gayatri, Srila Prabhupada came to the shore and he was sitting there. And the devotees were playing in the Yamuna waters, but they were just chanting Hare Krishna as they were playing. And when Srila Prabhupada saw that, he was so happy. Just seeing the devotees be in Vrindavan, in the Yamuna river, chanting Hare Krishna. This is what he had gone and traveled all the way to the west for. At the age of 70, having suffered 3 heart attacks. 2 heart attacks on the way, 1 heart attack in America. This is what he had gone all the way for. This is what he had prepared all his life for. Just to bring people closer to devotional service, closer to the Lord in Vrindavan. So the chanting of Hare Krishna, the distribution of books which convince our intelligence of the necessity of chanting Hare Krishna, and of centers like this, where individuals can congregate and come together to learn about the Lord and to chant together His names. One time, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's godbrother, Puri Maharaj, was in Chowpatty, And he was the last remaining disciple at that time. He must have been over 100 years old. And he came onto the Vyasa-san, and all the devotees had congregated in Chaupadi to hear him. And as Puri Maharaj was sitting on the Vyasa-san, he was speaking. And he said, amongst other things, he said, I have seen all the Vaishnavas here chanting, jumping, and if anybody's been to Bombay, Chaupadi, the way they dance is really special. He said, I've seen all these devotees jump, dance and shout Krishna's names in a lot of happiness. He said, many people think Krishna consciousness or spiritual life means to sit with some obscure philosophical book. In this case, he said the Shat Sandarbhas, and to sit in a corner and become a great scholar or become somehow some kind of pandit somewhere. He said, actually, that none of that is Lord Chaitanya's movement. He said, Lord Chaitanya's movement means to come together, as all of you have done, to chant and dance in Krishna, chanting Krishna's names together, and dance together in the congregational chanting of Krishna's names, and then to sit together and honor prasadam. He said, this is the sum and substance of Krishna's movement. Chant, dance, feast. These are the three things that constitute Lord Chaitanya's movement. And he said, this is so beautifully exemplified there. You will see hundreds of centers, ISKCON centers around the world. And no matter what they look like from the outside, no matter what color of Vaishnavas you see inside the temples, all of them come together to chant, hear about Krishna, dance congregationally together, and honor prasadam. And if you want to know what was Srila Prabhupada's heart, this was Srila Prabhupada's heart. The coming together, chanting, learning about Krishna, chanting, dancing together, and according to one's capacity, trying to give Krishna to others. To sum up and summarize what we were saying at the beginning, Srila Prabhupada is the unifying factor in all of ISKCON. There are hundreds of centers, many spiritual masters, all of whom have their own different projects, all of their own emphasis. But all of their intentions, their desires, and all of the projects that are happening, it might be the TOVP temple, it might be other scholarly research that's happening, it might be certain Nam Sankirtan programs, other outreach programs that are being started, book distribution initiatives, other new temples that are being initiated. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of projects all around the world. All of them tie in to Srila Prabhupada's emphasis and his vision and his desire for how the world should come to Krishna. It is sometimes said that Srila Prabhupada created a house in which the world could live. And it doesn't matter what religion a person may appear to be following. It doesn't even matter, what culture or habits a person has. But everyone has a place in this house, because it's the easiest thing in the world, it's the most natural thing in the world for people to come together and chant Krishna's names together. Chanting and dancing is the nature of the soul in glorifying the Lord. And that was the house that Srila Prabhupada set up for us to live in. So, Srila Prabhupada's book marathon is coming. I request all the Vaishnavas, to the extent that they can, please take books yourself or take books to distribute to others. Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki Jai.